This is John Musgrave. Thanks for clicking on the podcast. If you like this content or like this episode, please click the like button or even subscribe. Thanks very much. We continue on in John 18, and Jesus last week we were looking at him getting arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane, and we go on from there, repeating kind of the transitional verses there, beginning in verse 12. It's 766 if you haven't found it yet, and the Bible's in your seats. John 18, beginning in verse 12. This is God's word, eternally true. Then the detachment of soldiers with its commanders and the Jewish officials arrested Jesus. They bound him and brought him first to Annas, who was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, the high priest that year. Caiaphas was the one who had advised the Jews that it would be good if one man died for the people. Simon Peter and another disciple were following Jesus. Because this disciple was known to the high priest, he went with Jesus into the high priest's courtyard. But Peter had to wait outside at the door. The other disciple, who was known to the high priest, came back, spoke to the girl on duty there, and brought Peter in. "You are not one of this man's disciples, are you?" the girl at the door asked Peter. He replied, "I am not." It was cold, and the servants and officials stood around a fire and they had made to keep warm. Peter also was standing with them, warming himself. Meanwhile, the high priest questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. "I have spoken openly to the world," Jesus replied. "I always taught in synagogues or at the temple where all the Jews come together. I said nothing in secret. Why question me? Ask those who heard me. Surely they know what I said." When Jesus said this, one of the officials nearby struck him in the face. "Is this the way you answer the high priest?" he demanded. "If I said something wrong," Jesus replied, "testify as to what is wrong. But if I spoke the truth, why did you strike me?" Then Annas sent him, still bound, to Caiaphas the high priest. As Simon Peter stood warming himself, he was asked, "You are not one of the disciples, are you?" He denied it, saying, "I am not." One of the high priest's servants, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, challenged him, "Didn't I see you with him in the olive grove?" Again, Peter denied it, and at that moment a cock began to crow. Then the Jews led Jesus from Caiaphas to the palace of the Roman governor. By now it was early morning, and to avoid ceremonial uncleanness, the Jews did not enter the palace. They wanted to be able to eat the Passover. So Pilate came out to them and asked, "What charges are you bringing against this man?" "If he were not a criminal," they replied, "we would not have handed him over to you." Pilate said, "Take him yourselves and judge him by your own law." "But we have no right to execute anyone," the Jews objected. This happened so the words Jesus had spoken, indicating the kind of death he was going to die, would be fulfilled. Pilate then went back inside the palace, summoned Jesus, and asked him, Are you the king of the Jews?" "Is that your own idea?" Jesus asked. "Or did others talk to you about me?" "Am I a Jew?" Pilate replied. "It was your people and your chief priests who handed you over to me. What is it you have done?" Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jews. But now my kingdom is from another place." "You are a king then," said Pilate. Jesus answered, "You're right in saying I am a king. In fact, for this reason I was born, and for this I came into the world, to testify to the truth. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me." "What is truth?" Pilate asks. With this, he went out again to the Jews and said, "I find no basis for a charge against him. But It is your custom for me to release you one prisoner at the time of the Passover. Do you want me to release the King of the Jews?" They shouted back, "No, not him. Give us Barabbas." Now, Barabbas had taken part in a rebellion. Here ends our reading. There's a response of thankfulness. It's printed for you in your worship guide. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Thanks indeed. Let's pray. What we witness here in this passage from verses 12 through 40, Jesus was wrongly and unjustly crucified. And this is a thing that I think is, it's emphasized by John. And I think it's a more powerful thing than we realize as we do evangelism. Jesus was wrongly crucified. He was not dealt with in justice. People misevaluated him. And those who knew him and those who had any sense at all were not screaming for his crucifixion. Okay, and I think that's a good thing for a non-believer to deal with. That Jesus had done no wrong. And that he was crucified contrary to evidence. Contrary to what actually went on. So Jesus was wrongly and unjustly crucified. Acts 2, 22 to 24. Jim read this for us. Peter says, he didn't read Dale Carnegie, How to Win Friends and Influence People, before he gave his Pentecost sermon. He says, "Men of Israel," so he's talking to the Jews who had crucified Jesus. Some of them had. Some of them were just visiting from out of town. "Men of Israel, listen to this. Jesus of Nazareth, a man who credited by God to you by miracles, wonders, and signs, you should have known better, you, which God did among you through him, as you yourselves know. This man was handed over to you by God's set purpose and foreknowledge, and you, with the help of wicked men," right? See how winsome Peter is to the Jews? "You, by the help of wicked men, put him to death by nailing him to a cross." Lack of justice. Jesus is there doing miraculous signs, and these were not miraculous signs harming people. These were miraculous signs giving strength to legs that had never walked before, giving sight to eyes that had never seen before. I think it's Psalm 146:8 says, "God, the Lord gives sight to the blind." The Lord gives sight to the blind. And Jesus gave sight to the blind, and so he proved he was God. So this was an unjust death. He had done good things. He had taught God's people, and the people had all remarked, "Wow, this teaching, I've never seen anything like it." And he teaches with authority, not like the teaching of the scribes and the Pharisees. People should have been grateful. People should have been following him, just like the 12 disciples were, and the 200 that were 120 that were around in Acts chapter 1. They should have all been following him. And so Acts 53:8, you can see it in the front of your Declaration of the Gospel front page. He was oppressed and afflicted. He was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. Right? Christ lets other people speak for him. He doesn't go tit for tat with all the false accusations that come against him. He lets the public record speak for itself, and he's content to let people lie about the public record right before his face. So Jesus was wrongly and unjustly crucified. And here's some of the things about his unjust crucifixion and condemnation. Jesus was not rightfully condemned for anything he taught. Not rightfully condemned for anything he taught. Look at verses 20 and 21. They were asking him about his disciples and his teaching. Here's Jesus' response. I've spoken openly to the world, Jesus replied. I always taught in the synagogues, public space, or at the temple, public space, where all the Jews come together. I've said nothing in secret, that is, nothing of doctrinal content about himself. Why question me? Ask those who heard me. Surely they know what I said. He's not condemned for what he taught. He says, bring someone here. Have them tell the truth. And then try to condemn me then. But what was the problem with this, with what he taught? A1. Many things Jesus taught about himself people didn't like. Jesus taught things that were true out in the open. We saw it in chapter 8, right? Before Abraham was born, I am. I was around before he was because I'm God. Or in chapter 10, I and the Father are one. Jesus taught his own divinity. He was teaching things that some people didn't like. He claims in chapter 8 to be God, living before Abraham. And the unbelieving Jews understand his claim because they pick up rocks to stone him, the penalty for blasphemy, for saying something about God that is not true. Blasphemy. Jesus was saying he is God, and they said, well, we don't think you are. So that's not true. So they pick up stones to stone him, to put him to death for blasphemy. So he said something that was true, but it was just something they didn't like. Number 2. He said nothing wrong. He said nothing wrong. Nothing he taught was shown to be against the law or untrue, in other words. So verse 23 here in this passage, 23, Jesus said, if I said something wrong, testify as to what is wrong. But if I spoke the truth, why did you strike me? Okay, so Jesus says, ask anybody about what I've said. See if anything I've said is wrong, against the law, doesn't represent God rightly. And if so, sure, strike me in the mouth. But if not, which you haven't proven, so he says, why do you strike me? 12:37 notes that Jesus did many miraculous signs in their presence. And John writes, even though Jesus did many miraculous signs in their presence, they still would not believe in him. So it was a matter of will, not a matter of logic, not a matter of reasoned application of the facts and reasoned conclusions. Even though he did many more miraculous signs in their presence, John writes in verse 37 of chapter 12. In their presence, they saw these things. Still, they would not believe in him. And in John 5:37 through 40 and 46 and 47, Jesus points out that the writings of Moses spoke about him, but that they simply did not believe what Moses wrote. So he said, if you don't believe what Moses wrote, how are you going to believe what I say? Because Moses wrote about me. John 18:23. Here we see this statement. If I said something wrong, testify as to what is wrong. But if I spoke the truth, why did you strike me? And then number 3, but not proving any wrong in him. Notice they don't have a comeback to any of this. And Scripture points this out a lot of times. Where there are these statements where it says, and they had nothing to say. That's what happens when someone, puts facts in front of you that you can't dispute. You have nothing to say. And so you just bring up something else. Don't do that in marriage. Don't do that in marriage. When someone says, no, I've never said this to you, say, okay, yeah, I guess I can't think of a specific instance. Don't say, well, but you always do this. Don't do it. Betsy never says that to me. Don't worry. I never say that to her. Don't worry. No, we say it to each other, but that's not good. That's what always happened. But they had nothing to say. There's no comeback. They don't have true witnesses that come up and point out that something Jesus has said or done is against the law, or that something he said or done is wrong. They have nothing to say. So not proving any wrong in him, they didn't, it's important to see, they didn't release him, which is what they should have done. He challenges them. Have anyone testify for me, about me, and verify the facts. Please do this. And you'll find that I've done nothing wrong. I served at my university, Wittenberg University in Springfield, Ohio, on the student hearing board for two years. Some of you have heard this. And so what we did is we saw kids who had violated something in their dorms typically, or somewhere on campus. They had committed some violation that was kind of beyond the RA's authority because it was so egregious. It was so bad, but it was below the police. It was below bringing the police in. So we were kind of the in-between. It was like 8 of us. And so we would hear, and it was a hearing board. So it wasn't a jury trial. It was just a hearing board. So they'd come in to us, and the accused person would come in, and they could bring in any witnesses they wanted to bring in. They could say anything they wanted to say. It wasn't limited to what you were asked in a trial. You know, you get frustrated by that when you're watching law, movies and that kind of thing. The right questions can't be asked. And when someone starts telling the truth, they say, strike that from the record. You're like, wait, that's true. But it wasn't like that. It was a hearing board. So the accused could say anything they wanted to say. They could bring any witnesses they wanted to bring in. And the RA, whoever caught them, could also on the other side, could say anything they wanted to say, bring in any witnesses. And so we'd hear it all. But one thing I learned was this. Innocent people say, ask anybody. They're not afraid of witnesses. And so it was like when someone said, you can't prove it, we said, thank you very much. You just admitted your guilt. You just said, in fewer words, I did it, but you can't prove it. This is not a jury trial. We don't need to have a shadow of a doubt. All we need is your word admitting that you did it and that nobody saw you doing it. You just said you did it. On the other hand, and we've seen this in the church too, as we're talking with people through the wrongdoing that's been done. And one side comes in and says, ask anyone. And they're putting out all these facts, and they're like, yeah, and this was on, and this person was here, and that kind of thing. They want the truth to come out because the truth will exonerate them, prove them innocent. And that's what Jesus is doing here. You don't have to ask me. Ask anyone. Ask anyone. He's comfortable with what they'll find. But not proving any wrong, they didn't release him as they should have. What do? They elevate his case to the Roman government. We didn't prove it. Doesn't matter. We're taking you to Pilate. Okay, and so just if you have a question about just a really, really side point here. There are 3 trials that are going on. First, it's with Annas, 12 through 14. The second is with Caiaphas. And there's a little kind of statement that could confuse you in 24. It says, then Annas sent him still bound to Caiaphas. But he had come to Caiaphas, and we see that in verse 19. The high priest was questioning him. Caiaphas was the high priest there. And this statement then can be translated as thus, and it's there are all kinds of theories as to why that's put there instead of at the front there, but it's a retrospect thing. It was thus Annas has sent Jesus to Caiaphas. Here ends the reading. No. Here ends the trial with Caiaphas, and the next thing we see is verse 28. Then the Jews led Jesus from Caiaphas to the palace of the Roman governor. Okay, so if you're wondering about that, there you go. Side point over. Okay, but they elevate the case to the Roman government from verse 23 to verse 28. And then B. Jesus is wrongly condemned. Here's another reason we see that his condemnation was wrong, because Jesus had not been treasonous against Rome. Treasonous is a funny word to write. Write treason. You probably know how to write that. And then just write OUS. but it looks funny to me for some reason. But I spell checked it. There you go. So Jesus had not been treasonous to Rome. We can see this in verse 36. Look at verse 36 there. Jesus told Pilate the truth, and he said, "My kingdom is not of this world." Jesus was not trying to take over for Rome. He didn't want Pilate's position. He didn't want the position of the current Caesar of the day, whose name is escaping me right now. I don't think it's Augustus still. It could be. I don't think it is. But he's not treasonous against Rome, and Pilate sees this. That's why Pilate says, "I find no reason for any charge against him." Even though he's a king, I understand he's a king that's a king somewhere else. He's not threatening me. He's not addressing me like I'm an enemy that he's trying to get rid of. He's not after Rome's throne there. So Jesus was not treasonous against Rome. So Jesus is not condemned rightly by the Jews for transgressing their laws, which we saw in the first couple of things here. And he's also not rightly condemned by Rome. Because even though he was a king, it was like saying, I'm the king of pasta making. President Trump is not threatened by that. Okay? So Jesus is not treasonous against Rome, so he's wrongly condemned by Rome, wrongly put on a Roman cross because he hadn't done any crimes against Rome. Next, C, Jesus was wrongly condemned because the unbelieving Jews had no charge to bring against Jesus to Pilate. We can see this in verses 29 and 30. Look at verse 29. They first bring Jesus to Pilate, and it's their Passover, so they don't want to go into a Gentile house and be unclean and then not be able to celebrate the Passover. So Pilate says, okay, whatever. So he goes out and talks to them so they don't have to become ceremonially unclean. And he asked them for a charge. It said, so Pilate came out, verse 29, Pilate came out to them and asked, "What charges are you bringing against this man?" There are no charges. They say, "If he were not a criminal, we would not have handed him over to you. Please don't look at the man behind the curtain and see that we have no charges." It's like, you folks who are in Reformation theology, if you're, sometimes like when I was first in Reformation theology or Reformed theology as sometimes it's called, I had people who were of the dispensational stripe, which I was, say to me, "Oh, that Reformed theology, it's really dangerous." "Oh, what's dangerous about it?" "Oh, it's just really dangerous. You should stay away from it." They had no specific things to give to me, and they have no specific things to give about Jesus. They know he's not trying to take over Rome. They know he's not even trying to take over Jerusalem. They're disappointed by that he's not trying to be a political king to serve over Israel. So there, there's no charge to bring against him. They just say, well, he's a criminal. Okay, why is he a criminal? Nothing to say. Again, nothing to say. Now D. Jesus was wrongly condemned because the Roman government by Pilate declared Jesus to be innocent. We can see this in verse 38. This is where Pilate says this. With this, Pilate went out again to the Jews and said, "I find no basis for a charge against him." And this agrees with what we know about Jesus. 1 Peter 2:22. He committed no sin, nor was any deceit found in his mouth. Okay, so Pilate, even a Roman, a Gentile, a crass man, says, there's no reason for a charge against him. I find this man innocent. I find no basis for a charge against him. Now, E, Jesus was wrongly condemned because the unbelieving Jews, here's why he gets condemned. The unbelieving Jews just screamed hard. And we find out in the other Gospels as well that Pilate's just afraid of a riot. And he doesn't want to get in trouble with his superiors. I heard there was a riot down in Jerusalem. You're supposed to be in charge of things and keep the peace down there. Pilate sees there's going to be a riot, and so he comes out, he washes his hands and says, "I'm not taking any guilt over this man's death. Just putting him on the cross to calm you guys down. But he gets put on the cross because the Jews just screamed hard. That's nothing to do with justice. That's right. Do you cringe when there's some famous trial going on and there are mobs outside of the courtroom? What's that about, right? How about justice gets done instead of we're going to physically harm the lawyer of this guy if this guy gets off? Right? That's just mob stuff. It's like justice, right? We want justice done. And they just scream hard, ignoring, that's your next blank, ignoring the declaration of Jesus' innocence by Pilate, by the fact that their Sanhedrin, their ruling council, hadn't found anything wrong. They hadn't responded to the charges. If I've said anything wrong, tell me. They haven't responded, so they just ignore this declaration of Jesus' innocence, and they demand a treasonous man, Barabbas, instead, verses 39 and 40. We're to see this, we're to understand this, the injustice, the wrongness of Jesus winding up on a cross. And to top it off, the cherry on top, is they demand Barabbas. So know this, Jesus was wrongly and unjustly crucified. And then number five, and this is just this is what we'll talk about next week, but we say it for now. You are, number 5, you are to testify to the truth about Jesus. You're to testify to the truth about Jesus. And we can see here, and we'll talk about this next week, Jesus testifies to the truth about himself. Verses 33, 35, and 37. Annas, and then Caiaphas, and 33 and 35, and then to Pilate. He testifies to the truth about himself. Timothy talks about the good testimony that Jesus gave when he was before Pilate in 1 Timothy 6:13 there. Jesus testifies to the truth about Jesus, and Peter doesn't. Peter doesn't. Next week, we'll look at that contrast that John is bringing before us. Teaser there for you. Jesus testifies 3 times about himself truly. And what number 3 there is for Peter? 3 times. He's given 3. Jesus is given 3 opportunities to testify truly about himself, and he does. Peter's given 3 opportunities to testify truly about Jesus, and he doesn't. And we're to see this, and so we'll talk about that next week. So our summary for this week. Jesus was wrongly condemned and killed. But he was and is God. He was and is God who came into the world to be a king for God's people. He was and is God who came into this world to be a king for God's people. And today he is. And today he is a king. Today he is a king reigning over his people, the church, from his throne in heaven. Let's pray.